Look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Chairman Spratt, Mr. Ryan, members of the committee. I come before you at a time of great consequence both for our economy and for our fiscal future. When the President took office on January 20th, he inherited an economic crisis more severe than any since the Great Depression. Over the past 13 months, 3.5 million jobs have been lost, the greatest number since World War II. In December and January alone, 1.2 million jobs were lost. The economy contracted at more than 6% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of last year, and trillions of dollars in wealth have been destroyed, harming workers and families on the verge of retirement. Why has this happened? A central cause was the collapse in credit and capital markets, itself fueled by inadequate oversight, insufficient disclosure, distorted incentives, and excessive conflicts of interest. But the roots do run deeper. We have lived through an era of irresponsibility in which we have failed to address deep problems in energy, education, and healthcare, and in which the primary theory of the case was that the only determinant of economic performance was the marginal tax rate on the wealthy, and that the way to promote market competition was to channel significant subsidies to corporations. The result is a pair of trillion-dollar deficits. The first is the output gap, shown in my first slide, the gap between how much the economy could produce each year and how much it is producing each year. $1 trillion a year both this year and next year. The purpose of the Recovery Act was to start filling in that hole, jump-starting the economy, and returning us to a path of economic growth. The second deficit is the budget deficit. And as the next slide shows, under the policies that we are inheriting, we face trillion-dollar deficits out over time. And let me just pause and recognize that the influence of the economic crisis itself over this year and next year combined amounts to $2 trillion for the budget deficit. That comes from $600 billion that reflects a weaker economy, which drives down revenue and drives up spending on things like unemployment insurance. $650 billion in the steps that have been necessary so far and that may become necessary to address instability in our financial markets, and the $787 billion Recovery Act, which, as I already noted, was intended to start filling in that output gap. Looking forward, we must change course. If we don't adopt the policies that are in this budget, the budget deficit over the next decade will be $2 trillion higher, and we will not have addressed problems in our energy market, in our educational system, and in our healthcare system. So let me be a little bit more specific about the budget. First, the budget starts by giving an honest depiction of where we stand. We do not play the budget games that have been embodied in previous budgets in which you assume that the nation will never again face a hurricane or disaster, in which you assume that the alternative minimum tax will gradually overwhelm the tax code, in which you assume that Medicare physician payments will be reduced by 20%, and yet Medicare beneficiaries will still somehow have the opportunity to see their doctors, in which you assume that the cost of a war will immediately disappear. All in, the budget includes $2.7 trillion in costs over the next decade that would have been excluded from previous budgets. That sets a high bar, but it's an honest bar. With the scope of the problem recognized, the budget then starts the process, the hard process of reducing those deficits, as the next chart shows. In particular, we cut the deficit in half, the previous slide. We cut the deficit in half by the end of the president's first term. Where does that deficit reduction come from? It comes from four sources. First, eventually the economy will recover, and that does help to reduce the budget deficit. Second, winding down the war will reduce costs. Third, we do seek, after 2011, to restore some balance to the tax code, and that brings in additional revenue. And finally, we take a variety of steps to improve the efficiency of government. For example, by eliminating unwarranted subsidies to middlemen on educational loans, and by improving program integrity so that the right person gets the right benefit at the right time. Those two steps alone reduce the deficit by $100 billion over the next decade. Contrary to the analysis of many pundits, this budget is not a big spending budget. Unlike what has occurred in the past, we pay for our new initiatives in energy, in education, and in healthcare. Furthermore, if you look at non-defense discretionary spending, that is the basic operations of the government, relative to the economy, which is shown on the next slide, that spending, non-defense discretionary spending as a share of the economy, is projected to be 4.1% of the economy this year. Under our budget, it would average 3.6% over the next decade, and by the end of the budget window, it would reach 3.1% of GDP, the lowest since the data begin in 1962. This is simply not a big spending budget. We do, however, reorient our priorities towards long-term economic efficiency and productivity in energy, education, and especially in healthcare. First, on energy. The budget includes $15 billion a year in investments to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and improve energy efficiency. To finance that, along with tax relief in a fiscally responsible manner, the budget proposes a market-friendly cap-and-trade program on greenhouse gas emissions, which will not only raise revenue, but also help to address a key threat to our planet. In education, the budget invests substantial resources in early education, since all of the evidence suggests that that has significant payoff, and also works to improve college access, both by providing more solid funding for the Pell Grant program, continuing the American Opportunity College Tax Credit, and simplifying the application process so that more students can aspire to college and not face unwarranted obstacles in obtaining assistance to attend college. Finally, let me turn to healthcare. As the next slide shows, and as you've probably seen me repeat over and over again, healthcare is the key to our fiscal future. I think that chart illustrates it. The light blue area of the curve is Medicare and Medicaid. It's obvious from that graph that the thing driving our long-term fiscal issue is the rate at which healthcare costs grow. Healthcare costs, though, are not only a fiscal issue, they also affect workers, reducing workers' take-home pay already to a degree that I think is underappreciated and unnecessarily large, and also imposes burdens on state governments. For example, rising healthcare costs are crowding out state support for higher education, which in turn is raising tuition and forcing painful cutbacks at public universities. The Recovery Act starts the process of healthcare reform, and there are very substantial opportunities to reduce healthcare costs without harming health outcomes. I want to turn to the next slide, which illustrates that point. We have very substantial variation in how much healthcare costs across different parts of the United States, with the darker areas of the country having much higher cost per beneficiary than the lighter areas, for reasons that one cannot explain based on the severity of the conditions facing patients in those areas, or the cost of building a hospital, or the salaries for doctors. Rather, what varies is the intensity of treatment for the same type of condition across different parts of the United States. And the kicker is that the more intense, higher cost approaches don't seem to generate better outcomes than the less intrusive, less costly approaches. Researchers at Dartmouth College suggest that as much as $700 billion a year in healthcare costs could be eliminated from the system without harming health outcomes if we could move the parts of the country where medicine is practiced in the higher cost ways towards the practice norms in the lower cost areas of the country. The Recovery Act starts the process that will be necessary to capture that opportunity. It invests heavily in health information technology, in comparative effectiveness, which measures what works and what doesn't, and in prevention and wellness. The budget builds upon that by creating a $634 billion reserve fund as a down payment on further healthcare reform, half of which comes from efficiencies in the health system itself, including moving to a competitive bidding process for the private plans, Medicare Advantage plans, that cover Medicare beneficiaries, and that the evidence suggests cost Medicare $1,000 more per beneficiary than covering those same beneficiaries under the traditional Medicare system. Now, some say that health reform is a luxury we can't afford now. As I've been saying for a long time, I say that reducing costs and improving quality in healthcare is a necessity that we need to act upon this year. None of this is going to be easy, whether it's in education, in energy, in healthcare, responsibly reducing the deficit in an honest way over the medium term. But as the country music singer Toby Keith once put it, there ain't no right way to do the wrong thing. And this budget reflects that notion. In being honest, in reducing our medium-term deficit by $2 trillion, in investing in education and energy, and in moving toward a more efficient healthcare system with lower costs and higher quality, I hope you will all work with us to do the right thing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.